are just so much less dramatic. There's so much less drama, and when, like for me, when I feel like I just notice I'm a little bit off, and I go, oh, you know, lately I've been working a lot with. There's no either. What do you say? No either or. I'm sure you've said that all along, but I just only heard it about a week ago. So. Been working with that, but like right now, I just feel like there's just little bitty adjustments instead of just and so life is very, very calm, and without that old idea I had that if you're not calm, something's wrong. You know, like I don't need to be calm anymore, and as a result, I might be calmer. Yeah. I think that's probably what all these teachers are trying to get at, but everybody gets the wrong idea. It's kind of forever sometimes. And so, I guess I have to look backwards to see where I'm at. Like, just as I'm going along my day, I don't think about it too much. I just try to go along in my day. Have that be sufficient, and it's working. It's working pretty damn well.
There's lots of signs and symptoms of the effectiveness of engaging in this yoga, but they're not important in themselves, even though they seem to be, perhaps, they may be touted as being advantages or things to try to cultivate or something, but in actuality they're not particularly important in themselves, although they do come with, and they are signs of success, of successful engagement. And it can be virtually impossible to assess how you're doing, so to speak, except in taking a very big view, because there's, you've probably heard me talk about it before, but there's this funny phenomena where your present condition always feels more or less the same, because however much you have developed in various ways, you also develop your sensitivity. So you're more and more sensitive to the ways in which you haven't developed them. So you're more sensitive to your own shortcomings. So it seems to be about the same as it always was. Where I've got it pretty together, but God, there's all this stuff that I'm just that's just really sloppy and really ragged that I really wish I was more on top of. And that kind of balance will feel more or less proportional to the way it always has. But then if you look back, you'll think, God, but my standards have changed enormously. It used to be, something that I would consider, my normal getting by mode now I would have once considered super functional, or super, whatever. And so it's this very strange phenomena, that your sensitivity increases as your functionality increases, so you aren't necessarily aware that your functionality is increasing. But again, when you sort of take a long view and you think, well, what was my normal state of mind 10 years ago? And then you get more of a sense of how things are going. But of course, it's not really important how things are going anyway, because the point is to be engaged with your experience as nakedly as possible, continually, or on an ongoing basis, let's say, and let wherever you are, it takes care of itself, and it's not really meaningful anyway. It's not. In other words, it's not this yoga is not a goal orientation. It's just the process is the goal, just to be in it, and it is life.
That being said, we still do walk backwards.
Sure.
Because we can't see in the future, but we can recollect an impression of the past.
Sure, of course.
Well, that engagement is interesting. I remember when I looked back at what was happening after sitting and being exposed to the teaching, I was kind of disgruntled because I felt I've just built this big watcher. I've now become a watcher of my life instead of engaged in it and really active and participating. And so I kind of thought the watcher would go away and I would be more engaged. And but so it seems like there's almost this catch-22 of not having your life dramatic and yet being open to everything and living fully and yet watching it at the same time because you're noticing.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is intrinsic, but again, you know, watching and participating aren't opposites, aren't either or. There is always a facility which is engaged, which is engaged in which. I mean, experience is experienced. Experience is watched profoundly, and it's very much like a dream in the sense that there's nothing actually happening. So there's nothing happening actually but watching. So in one sense, watching is very much an actuality. But that doesn't. But again, that's not an opposition, or it's not an either or. You know, watching, could you call it detachment, or having, you know, multidimensional points of view that are seemingly vast. Let's say, to arbitrarily qualify it. You know, to have these kinds of points of view. And at the same time, to be engaged in the moment, and you discover it's not an either or. It's not like you have to extricate some attention from watching to be engaged, or vice versa, because it's all happening. And in fact, that's the very essence of this yoga: is to be inclusive with all of these different levels and dimensions, and you know, seeming proportionalities and points of view, perspectives, simultaneously, inclusively, and see that they're not mutually exclusive, they're not contradictory. They're all equally true, and none of them is absolutely true or dominates, or has a precedent or a greater importance.
Well, I guess there's a kind of inscrutability, room for inscrutability when you're not totally immersed or taken over by circumstances.
Yeah, I guess. I'm not sure I understand exactly what you mean.
Well, I was very aware of not having been a watcher before, and I think most people, before they do kind of spiritual practice, don't see that they're not noticing, they're not seeing.
Yeah.
And
Sure.
then it becomes kind of second nature. I mean, it's like, well, it's so obvious that is how you participate by also noticing and seeing. But the real spontaneousness, though, is that it doesn't seem like that can be like fully spontaneous when there is also a degree of being aware of what's happening at the same time.
Really?
It seems like it's moment. It comes afterward, but not at the same time.
I don't know. I guess I don't notice that myself. It may just be a way that you're working with things at the moment that may be a transitional mode or something. I don't know.
So you're saying noticing is happening simultaneously with everything?
Well, of course, there's nothing but noticing, but fundamentally, all modes happen concurrently. There is absolute spontaneity, there's absolute engagement. There's even being completely lost in the energy of participation and engagement and playing the game, whatever. And at the same time, there's different dimensions of detachment, and there's dimensions of complete transcendence, just way out there that are also. There's just all these different modes that are simultaneously and concurrently are aspects of this, and you can't deconstruct them or put them. You can't make a map of them. You can't find a structure there. But there's just infinite flexibility in all of this. This is all of this, and this is all of this in actuality, right here, right now. And it always has been. So again, this is not a matter of cultivating a new way of functioning so much as it is a matter of coming to notice more and more fully the complete aspects of what this is, of what is present. And then you notice these aspects, and certain of them will seem to have predominance depending on what you're working with at the time. You might be noticing the engagement, you might be noticing the detachment, you might be noticing the transcendence, you might be, whatever, right? And even qualifying them is absurd.
But you're saying that you're finding that it is simultaneous. That's interesting.
It's what?
That it's simultaneous.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And there's nothing blocks anything else. Nothing precludes anything else. It's not like you need to rob Peter to pay Paul. Rob Paul to pay Peter. It sounds better to me for some reason. I don't know why. But in other words, you don't need to have something be diminished or less full in order for something else to be emphasized. It's not like that.
Really? It's not just happening that moment and then something
Well, no, it is that, but it's not. But in other words, if there is some degree of watching, doesn't mean there needs to be less engagement necessarily. See what I mean? In other words, it's not like energy is withdrawn from something and put into something else. It doesn't need to be that way. It can seem to be that way because, in the process of your yoga, you will explore various different modes, and you'll be in various different apparent polarities, and you'll be with them, and you may find certain degrees of apparent stucknesses and so on. But this is all the very process of working through it.
Well, I find that it's like there's a moment of total surprise.
Mm-hmm.
When you can actually be surprised by something, and
Oh,
in
yeah.
that moment, there's just surprise.
Yeah.
And then there's a noticing that
Yeah.
there was a surprise. And
Yeah.
To me, it's just all these things happening.
Right. Yeah, it is. Yeah, for sure. What I'm suggesting is as you proceed with your yoga, with your noticing, things will tend to become less snappy, either or, and tend to become, more. Oh, actually, I'd say maybe tend to become less coherent. It's hard to qualify. But you'll discover you live simultaneously in infinite dimensions, and each of them is unique in its modes that it implies or suggests in terms of engagement or lack thereof, or perspective or perspectives or lack thereof, or whatever. And it's just how it is, and the sky's the limit. And none of these modes block or inhibit or impinge upon any of the other modes. They all just coexist, you might say. And you're all of it. But again, as you come to this, progressive integration, it can look like all different sorts of things at different times and in different, in different, in different of your own process in this.
Can I go back to what Nancy was saying?
Yeah.
That for me, I don't trust my impressions anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what's going on now.
Right.
And I don't know, absolutely have no idea what happened a year ago or a week ago.
Yeah.
I have pictures and memories, but I don't trust them. And in fact, I know that they're incorrect.
Yeah.
At least they feel incorrect.
Yeah.
So I really don't have that perspective.
Right. Well, as you come to see this, what this is clearer and clearer, you see more and more profoundly how it's completely transcendental. There's no way you can get a handle on it, even slightly, and this just becomes more and more obvious, and it's just, I mean, you just can't say anything. And yeah, that's absolutely true. For sure.
And yeah, I don't feel I'm missing anything.
No, well, that's the point, is that because you see that there is nothing to miss because there is nothing. There's nothing qualifiable. This is absolutely unqualifiable. And so as such you can't say or think or posit anything whatsoever about it.
But there are even practical things, like I got in the car and I travelled here and I looked at the clock when I got in the car and I wasn't sure if I had 30 minutes later, or whatever it was, any real recollection of what time it was I got in the car. I mean, on a practical level, it's becoming difficult to...
You can't know, can you?
Absolutely cannot know.
Yeah. And then there's the fact that we're aging too, so there's dementia setting in, which doesn't...
Well, there's definitely...
complicates the issue.
He's got retirement mentality.
Did you get my invoice? Yes, I did. Twice, in fact. Just to make sure.
Overpaid and needs a refund.
Yeah, all these different modes of playing with this are they're provisional, they're exercises, they're experiments, and ultimately they're experiments whose purpose is to discover their invalidity, to discover that what this is completely, entirely unqualifiable, ungraspable, undefinable, to the nth degree, to the point that that talking is a complete absurdity.
But yet there's this experience like the other day, I had an experience where it was beyond words. It was completely mind-blowing. It was an experience of of knowing that I don't know. I mean, it was but it was so solid that there's something. There's a tendency. It's kind of like an addiction almost of wanting, of trying to describe that I know that I don't know, and that I know.
Sure.
It's just it's such a catch.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is part of the paradox of our natures. The aspect of our functionality, which is the mentality. Its basic approach is to just try and describe. And when you start engaging with the manifestly undescribable, it tries to start describing the ways in which it's undescribable. But that's just that engine is just left running, and so it keeps cranking out its product, which is this attempt at analysis.
Well, and a tendency to repeat that experience, because that experience was that realization, even though this experience right here, right now, is that too.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And You know, I mean, and this is the nature of this process of this unfoldment is continually revisiting, not literally revisiting, but you know, all of these different modes and just being with them from fresh angles and you know more and more subtlety and more dimensionality, more and more nuance, and just really mastering this. You know, it's the first time we get to something. It's like oh wow, you know, but it's still a relatively, let's say, one-dimensional oh wow in terms of you know just you know metaphorically speaking. But so you'll revisit that kind of mode many times from many angles, and it becomes more rich and more subtle and more dimensional. And you revisit the you know at first the analytical mind seems to be really a problem, and the sort of the analytical mind versus this amazing you know whatever, and they seem to be an either or. But again, you sort of hang out with that long enough, and you're with the nuance and the subtlety of that, and you discover that you know it's just not like that. It's just not like that. It's you know, but this, I mean, that's the joy of this yoga is that, you know, once you touch the amazingness of this, you're completely addicted, you know. And it will just keep drawing you to it and drawing you to it again and again and again in ever fresh ways, in exploring ever fresh modes and apparently revisiting old virtual modes in the guise of fresh modes and so on and so forth. So the process is like being a junkie. The process is just letting it pull you in, let it pull you in, let it pull you in, let it pull you in again and again. And just by doing that, it inherently refines itself and just deepens and subtlifies and becomes more rich and nuanced and integrated, let's say. It's nice to have a path whose sole practice is yielding to addiction. Yield to pleasure. Hard to argue with, you know, it's really hard to...
It reminds me of like going to Knott's Berry Farm and going on that roller coaster that's really awesome, and then like, the minute I got off, I'd run as fast as I can, get back in line, and then run as fast as
Yeah.
But then realizing, at the end of the day, going to sleep was just as fun because you had
Yeah.
this.
No downside.
Is there anything special about being aware of radiance in the company of other people who are aware of radiance? Because it's a long drive for me, so sometimes I want on Justin TV, and the experience is just so wildly different. I mean, I come here and I get high.
Yeah.
And
for all those Justin watchers out there.
Right, sure. I mean, it's like swimming in jello.
Yeah, sure.
You know? And so there seems to be, and I know that everything is special, but there just seems to be something remarkable, particularly remarkable about being in the presence of you, and also being in the presence of other people who are, I don't know, sort of in a safe space or something.
Sure. Just, and again, it's ultimately mysterious and miraculous, and you can't qualify it, say what it is in any way. But the most, it's very obvious, and it's valuable. It's also valuable to be on your own, where it's less obvious, and in a different way. Everything has its advantages, everything has its disadvantages, everything has its utility. So, it's being in this kind of immersive mode is very valuable, but being out of it is equally valuable. Sort of, you're working the same issue from the opposite end, maybe, to put it arbitrarily. Because it's all really just about being with this in its vast range of various modes. Let's say, not that there is a finite number of those or anything, but just metaphorically speaking, loosely speaking, and the more we approach this in different modes, in different flavors, in different contexts, let's say, the more we this is the process. This is how we learn it. We discover its nuance and its subtleties and its dimensionality. But the richness of this kind of immediate resonance is powerful and profound and valuable.
for me, it's sort of like a recharging. I mean, I
Sure.
sometimes feel like I've sort of lost connection a little bit.
Sure.
The world is.
Yeah.
I find myself in a rut again.
Yeah. And that's, but that mode, the mode of having lost connection and being in a rut, is one of reality's major modes. It's not actually a lesser mode than the mode of sort of being tuned in and zapped and high and really zinging with it. And coming to see that, coming to be with that, is really the point of all this. Which is not to diminish the value of a more immersive
Sure.
experience. But the point is not to move from that to this. The point is you see what's here, and then find the way in which what's here is actually everywhere. It's broadening your taste, broadening your spectrum of appreciation, to find the miraculous in the mundane, to find the miraculous in the tedious, and in the neurotic, and the so on and so forth. But an ideal practice, if one might want to qualify it that way, might be to find yourself in this kind of a situation and then leave it, and then come back and then leave it, and come back and then leave it. And that way you're kind of exposing it's like kneading dough. You're kind of exposing it to a bunch of different modes, and rather than becoming, because if it's all one mode, it can be numbing and cloying, and you miss the dimensionality of it. It can be actually very limiting. So being thrust into very different modes is actually an advantage. But having a North Star, being tuned into the juice of it is obviously also very valuable.
That's one of the puzzles is if you're totally in that run, you don't feel any energy. What is there that you found here?
Yeah.
You're looking around for it, but you're looking for this shiny energy,
Yeah.
good feeling, and it's not there. It's something.
Right.
It's got to be something else.
Yeah, that's the point.
More fundamental.
Yeah, that's exactly the point.
Yeah.
It's about refining your appreciation, refining your recognition. I mean, it's really when it's zapped and like this, it's really obvious. It doesn't take much subtlety or acumen to notice that. But again, so this is all about refinement of recognition, refinement of appreciation, broadening your palette of subtlety and nuance, of coming to perceive what is actually present in any quality or dimensionality of experience. And not even finding some common denominator necessarily, although it could be described as that, but just finding that it is more than you're used to sitting with it as being. Just that, just moving, even slightly into moreness. It's understandable, and it's very easy to qualify this in terms of what it looks like. But that's entirely beside the point. And it's like, oh, this looks good, and it's luscious, and it's trippy, and I'm getting a buzz, and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, okay, cool, that's great. But it's not about that. That's there, but it's not about that. And the same when it looks like the opposite. Okay, that's there, but it's not about that.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean you shouldn't enjoy the trippy buzz.
No, by all means, it's all good. No, it's all good, but it's not about what it looks like. And learning to be with this more and more profoundly is basically letting go of appearances letting go of needing it to, or hoping for it to look this way as opposed to that way, basically on any level whatsoever. When it's all the same, even without denying the difference, even with all the difference, when it's all the same in terms of you're giving a shit about it, that's when you're able to be with this very precisely. In other words, you appreciate the difference in what it looks like, but it's not about that. That's not what you're relating to. You're not relating to what it looks like. And so, so this is a fine point. Because in ignorance, we're completely relating to what it looks like. We want to win, we want to be rich, we want success, we want to get laid a lot, we want this, we want that, I don't know, whatever, right? But all of that is appearances. All of that is what we want to look like, what we want the plot line, what we want the caption to say, and that's there, but it's not about that. And so it's all about completely weaning, completely weaning ourselves, learning that there's more. It's not about what it looks like.
Well, even this shiny eyes is so much not that. Either it's something so much like it's right.
Yeah.
I mean, sure.
Yeah.
Even come close to seeing that it's this or that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Internet question.
Yes.
Would you please say something about emotions and moods, the changeability and the seeming powerfulness of them?
Okay. Emotions and moods are completely changeable. They're nothing but change. They have absolutely zero stability. And like all phenomena whatsoever have absolutely zero stability. All experience whatsoever is in a constant state of flux and change. Emotions seem to have urgency and importance because they are symptoms of our orienting to our experience in terms of various definitions of it. So if you define, your relationship with people as being a certain way, and if it turns out to be some other way, then you may have an emotional reaction. But the emotional reaction is actually a reflection of the definition being disproved, being challenged. And relating to your experience in terms of its definitions is a very superficial way to relate to experience. And yet, understandably, we've all been there. This is where most people, this is where most people live and where most people have come from. This process is about learning that what is here is profoundly and ultimately undefinable, and to relate to it more subtly and more richly, we have to learn how to let go of our definitions, how to learn to see the ways in which our definitions are inadequate, are too simplistic, are too forced, too averaged out, on inconceivably complex and subtle and multidimensional actualities, which cannot be collapsed to simple definitions. And emotionality per se persists, but emotionality subsides to a rich tidal ebb and flow of luscious qualities and luscious richnesses and fullnesses, rather than being the kind of a knee-jerk of happy, sad, giddy, angry that we experience when we relate to our experience more definitionally, more in terms of what we're narrating it to be or interpreting it to be. So when you ask about emotions, the real issue is about definitions. It's about what you think is happening. And ultimately you will discover that whatever you think is happening is erroneous, is simplistic, is inadequate, is not able to capture the subtlety and complexity and nuance of actual event. And then those kinds of reactive emotions fall away and become much richer and much less targeted to specific apparent events.
So there's a follow-up question here from the previous question. She's saying, any thoughts on why we define?
Well, it's the basic more immature mode of the way reality approaches itself. Reality is intensely curious about what it is. So reality looks at itself and asks itself what it is. And if it settles onto any simple ways of answering that question, that basic inquisitiveness, it will latch onto those and try to milk them and see how far it can go. And we all experience this in our own individual lifespan, where as children we're curious about the world, and people tell us, oh, this is this, that's that, this is a car, this is a tree, this is a lady, and all of a sudden oh, great, wonderful. So we become intoxicated with this power of being able to define things, and only after long experience with that do we discover its limitations, and we begin to discover, well, this defining thing is pretty powerful, but it really has a lot of unpleasant side effects, and there may be in other ways of going about this, and that's when what might be called more spiritual and more rich ways of approaching experience begin to be played with. And then you might move into spiritual inquiry of some kind, or you might move into depth psychology. I mean, God knows what, right? But it's different. It's ways of exploring alternatives or additions to a simple definitional way of relating to things, which is so obviously limited, even though it's the predominant mode explicitly employed by our culture. But these sort of general questions about where things come from and all that is not particularly relevant. The relevant questions are about where are you now and what can be meaningful in that context. So, good questions are really about practicality of what you seem to be tripping over or stumbling against or wrestling with, and exploring ways to be with that more subtly or more multidimensionally.
Jeff and I were trying to think of questions on the way over here. We were calling it Stump the Guru.
What are you calling what?
Stump the Guru. But then we decided, no, that the kind of question you describe are probably much more interesting, much better.
Oh, I don't know. I'd like to hear one of your stuff with you.
I know that Jeff could think of
Just pass the buck. Pass the buck.
pass the ball over to Jeff.
Well, any questioning is about discovering that the pointlessness and the powerlessness of specific answers. You know, to learn to give up on these simple modes of trying to be with this in terms of pinning it down, and letting go into this luscious, inconceivably rich actuality that cannot be defined. It cannot even be started to be defined. And so a question predicated on the notion that there might be an answer is ignoring that wonderful, most powerful, most profound fact. So, you know, the only real use of questions is to lead to their own transcendence, is to lead to their letting go of the question. It's not so much about getting an answer so much as it is about discovering the pointlessness of the mode of asking questions.
But sometimes I've asked something, basically maybe I've tried to describe, experience that I'm undergoing now, or something some revelation or something.
Yeah.
And you've been able to, you don't give an answer, but you put it in context, or you might put it in a tradition, like some of the Dzogchen.
Well, that's a good use for questions. Is something you're personally that's meaningful to you personally that you're coming up against or working with.
Yeah.
Because then you can take that and get mileage out of it, not by finding an answer, but by being able to move into something else, until something else comes up that you're tripping over, that is in some way seeming to be an issue in any way whatsoever, and then you can look at that, and again, so it's all about overcoming apparent obstacles, let's say.
Yeah,
and
sometimes
practice.
in a very gentle way. I mean, like I'll have this, what the hell was that? And then you'll say something, and so I can see that.
I mean, basically, what I was saying, in other words, is that philosophy is pointless. Only yoga matters,
Right.
which is your own personal, and the degree to which you individually can, can get mileage out of what you're working with. And theory be damned.
Isn't yoga actually the core of philosophy?
Well, you'd think. Except I'd say by and large, yes, but it's very, very indirect mode. In other words, philosophy is a yoga, but it's a very inefficient yoga.
But the basis of every philosophy comes down to just plain yoga.
When you say basis, if you mean origin, yes, or the point, yes, but the exercise of philosophy departs from that.
Exercise, absolutely, but the origin and the point of
I mean, look at the edifice, the astounding edifice of Buddhist philosophy. I mean, there's thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of volumes of argument and counter argument and all this philosophy, which all comes from the Buddhist silence. I mean, the one thing is Buddha's sitting there and he goes, "Oh," right, and all of these volumes are about that, and yet none of them are that explicitly.
Yeah.
And so, the problem with the path with philosophy as a yoga is you typically have to go out and get whirled around by it for long enough till you begin to get tired or bored and get to say, wait a minute, This has either got to be pointless, or there's got to be some way to deflate it, or some way to bypass it, or some way to get to the core. And then you get to the core, essentially by abandoning philosophy and going to yoga. But yeah, no, of course, everything is yoga. There's nothing but yoga. I mean, yoga is just a synonym for life. Life is this exploring itself. And, the degrees of yoga is simply a matter of degrees of efficiency. But there's nothing but. I mean, the wildest, most pathetic, stupid ignorance is pure yoga. But it's a particularly sloppy, virulent, inefficient mode. 100,000 lifetimes later, wait a minute, maybe there's another way to do this.
It did take a
Peter, someone asks, how do I know if noticing is happening?
You know if noticing is happening if you find yourself with a wow factor going on. If you find yourself being in amazement. If you find yourself experiencing something that you have absolutely you're just amazed by and have absolutely can't get a handle on and have no idea what it is. To some degree.
Yes.
It's stumped, I wouldn't put, stumped implies a finality. This is more of a
Well, as
woo!
in the description and definition ceases, sometimes it's like
Yeah,
you're,
sure.
You're like, oh.
And somebody else asks, how can I be with depressed moods or feelings?
Be with what is actually present. Don't be with it as a depressed mood or a depressed feeling. Be with it as a flavor. And if you're with it as a flavor of energy, outside of any context of defining it as being one thing or another, you'll discover it's an amazing, absolutely astounding, trippy symphony of qualities and energies, and it will in that engagement it will transcend being simply depressed or anything like that. In other words, be with the actual experiential energy of the experience rather than being with it in a context in which it is depression.
Which means don't interpret.
Right.
Yeah, find yourself outside of it, but don't try to suppress interpretation. Bypass it by letting yourself be seduced by the texture of the actual experiential presence.
And then finally, I don't see any doer, so I end up not doing much, but still feeling the need to do something. Can you say something about this?
Okay. Well, there's as much doer as there ever was, and things get done or they don't get done. But the present moment will happen, and things will happen. And sooner or later, you'll get hungry, and you'll go in search of food, or you'll need to go to the bathroom, and you'll go try and find a bathroom, or else you'll get good at cleaning up the floor. Something will happen, And so the motive of event is continuous and is omnipresent. In other words, things will continue to happen. Shit ain't going to stop happening just because there's no doer.
The person that feels like they need to do something.
Well, feeling you need to do something is itself a doership. What's doing that? I mean, motives arise, and you can split hairs of, well, does it come from a doer or not? It's irrelevant. It's like, sooner, your itches appear and your hand reaches up to scratch them or not. Hunger appears and you go in search of food or not. An urge to find company appears and you pick up the phone or not. But these things are mysterious and actual in their apparition, and splitting hairs of whether there's doership or not is really just, it's just philosophy. I mean, all this sort of Advaita speak and this Advaita philosophizing, who's asking the question, there is no doer, all this stuff, to me is just like cobwebs. It's not particularly clarifying or useful. my advice is look at actuality of experience, and then don't worry about whether or not there's a doer, whether or not there's a self. Just look at there's something, or there is, let's say. Experience is, whether or not it's anything, but it is nonetheless. And just check that out directly without worrying about qualifying it as being this or that. I mean, the real teacher, the real spiritual master is experience. But that's the teacher of everything and always has been. School of hard knocks.
So you can't stop the guru.
The guru's going to stomp you.
Stomp.
Oh, stomp. Oh, sorry. Life wins, death wins. Try and stump that.
It's a cricket town, John.
You know, Peter, you talked about the wow factor. Right now, my experience, I don't know if I'd call it that. It's just seems very quiet, very gentle, very subtle. It's like things keep blending into themselves somehow.
Sure. Yeah.
So, but that doesn't feel like wow.
No, it's not important.
Okay.
I mean, the wow factor is more about a more superficial, immature mode of noticing. You know, if you're just trying to break into noticing, then my advice would be look for a wow factor. When you get some chops up and you develop some subtlety, then you don't need to be told what it is, you find it for yourself. And ultimately you discover that the essence of noticing is subtlety, infinite subtlety. And you can find that anywhere. Of course, you can't not find it anywhere.
Is there anything like a bit of a Rosetta Stone to all of this, though?
No, it is its own. It is its own Rosetta Stone.
Mm-hmm.
It is its own
So it's
map.
sort of realizing that, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's letting go of Rosetta Stones is the Rosetta Stone.
Right.
You know, letting go of mappings, letting go of the arrogance of interpretation, and that's when things start to get simple and really efficient. You know, you let it, trust it to show you to be however it is, and all of a sudden you're in, you know, it's like critical mass, and the reaction takes off, as opposed to these very, very, very inefficient modes of, you know, trying to analyze and figure out and get answers, and well, wait a minute, that's it's not like that because, you know, it's like those kind of modes are, I mean, they're valuable as in their own right, but they're the equivalent of, you know, Stone Age versus, you know, quantum mechanics or something. If you'd like to have a break, now would be a good time. We're going to take a little 10-minute break, and we'll be back shortly.
Ooh, I want one of those. Let me see. Keep it back. We don't want to get rowdy. No, then you get, everyone wants to get laid. And short of that, you get a vibrating pillow. Where'd you get it? Baxter? Yeah. Cool. I got it.
work.
She did?
No.
You're still on
Well, as much as possible, yeah. I mean, I find some, so we get 32 last October. We'll probably only have we're not, very routine.
When you're writing in your blog, do you have a specific audience? Is it the group that you work with?
That came from,
Yeah, there's a list of about 300 people, but of course that's totally inflated. I mean, it goes out to that many people. How many it is, and then the Facebook crowd is really not that much different than the email list.
So, you're all great.
Is there a group of people that you actually meet physically with?
3 times a week.
And they're part of what you would be writing. So is it that to them that you're sending your text?
Here's my own sexual interest in writing and sharing media. That there's anyone that's on the other end.
You're writing as though you're writing impressions. To somebody. The phraseology and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It feels like that.
Right.
Almost like a letter.
Yeah.
So it got me thinking about, is he seeing a bunch of faces and
Yeah. That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
I think it just comes out that way. It's more conversation.
No, don't cut that open. I thought maybe you had some potted pills or some enzyme pills or something. I think that's well, I know. We're not going to cut this up now. No, but also, I'm having problems. You're saving it for something else. Haven't you?
I don't know if it's good for
Look at that.
feels like a sign.
Love that. Anybody else want some pineapple? I don't want to be cut up. Don't cut it up. Okay.
I mean, sometimes I have the pleasure of corresponding with someone that asks a question and wants to kick stuff around and would like to write. And so that, of course, is a lot of fun. Put something on paper and unravel it or dismantle it or, wrap it around the softball field and see what happens.
Oh, yeah.
It's also like giving people permission to explore their own views. Right? Because I don't know how to write. I'm a writer. What? But if it's evocative, then it's fun to do it, and we're fun to read it. And then it seems to inspire some people that might not be able to just, channel, try it, send something back. So that's kind of fun too.
What is your group? Roughly how many?
You made it go.
I'm regularly
And that's more sex.
You say 3
Yeah. Every day.
Fun? Anyway, you laugh. Right.
Okay, yeah,
Is there a difference
It's not just that style of presence or communication. I think it's also, what people have read, what they've studied, what they've practiced, right? That influence is their approach to this. So if someone that loves Eckhart Tolle shows up, then we put him in the shred, right? If someone else shows up and has read Iron Man 5 times, then put that in the shred.
well, that's like astrologers and things.
It's going in the shredder.
It has to, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, the other reason why it was so interesting.
It's part. I've just read a few things so far, but that's part of the beginning of the teaching.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
It's, for me, it's part of my nature. It's just, let's get really emphatic about this. Doesn't mean we're right or anyone has accomplished anything, but let's give it a whirl. What are the consequences of some of these observations?
Yeah.
And not in a conjectural or abstract manner, but what are the consequences of these observations now? And we don't often we're not trained to converse that way. Right? And so, everyone gets on the elevator and it's forward. But here it's like, do the hokey pokey on the elevator and see what happens. So a lot of it that way is just fun as a kind of a dreaming cooperative.
So you just know.
To be social together.
Yeah.
Oh my
In the
God.
context of noticing.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you. This is so good.
People love it. Some, not everyone.
It'll make me feel better soon, I'm sure.
But some that have it in their lives do want a form of vehicle to articulate that.
But you're having potatoes. Then you'll have to find out.
No, I should like that. Well, by my iron fist. Think of it as just quality control, right?
Yeah.
Quality assurance. Because, we naturally, let's say, have a tendency, the inertia is to degrade into a story, conjecture, and abstraction. That's how we so then my job is to hold people perfectly tight, right? With the attention on the bindu. Right? So instead of degrading into a story, snap it back into what's your observation now?
I'm grateful. Full above.
Me too.
Yeah. You've got a whole portfolio at your disposal, right? To shift from abstraction to presence. Yeah.
Oh, it's wonderful.
And that always changes. What the mood is.
Yeah. Oh, this is for the net.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh no, I'm loving it.
Was bears, but
Well, it's
then
rare
and
that
registered
can.
time.
In my experience, it's rare that
Hey, thank you. Parker Brothers.
Vintage film.
Yeah, hey, yeah, let's,
it's rare.
That's my experience too.
Just the same, rare anyway. Rare is funny words. Maybe it weren't even
That's part of the socio-political to make that more common. Yeah. Business locally, discovery, also kind of a little bit of a grassroots shift in consciousness.
oh, wait a minute.
Thanks a lot for taking that stuff, Pam. Thanks a lot for taking that stuff down.
I see it.
Yeah, you will.
Kind of a really fine line to walk.
Not that I think you have the time even through.
It's a real question of trees that
No,
fall
I'll keep you for a little while
over
longer.
the
Thank you very much. Yeah, that was awesome.
Yeah.
Why not? One day you're just going to be mulch. We'll be picking out when you're mulch. Somebody else will be picking out when you. One day we'll be mulch. Right? Just sit there long enough.
That might be the first fermentation upon the The sweeter words that
Emaho.
Was the Tibetans like to sing? Oh,
It really is.
Beauty bark. Beauty bark. I'm beauty bark. Just a little vein.
The things that I noticed.
Even beauty bark. Yeah, some days I feel more like the shred of fire.
Would you close the door then?
Yes, Pam's coming right behind.
Oh, okay.
I need it. I'm a teacher. Even that is just.
Let me see if those questions are still back on.
Wow. It's like fire.
Maybe we can regroup.
Maybe.
I'm going to start the recorder back up.
I have a question from the internet.
Yeah,
You ready for it?
sure.
Okay, wait a minute, let me find it again. It's just been a lot of chattering while we were breaking. Oh shoot. Let me see if I can paraphrase it here. He was asking about if you can talk about depression. I mean, what is depression? And then she said practical ways to see through it or to use it, I guess.
I think we already talked about that, didn't we?
I thought so too, but she wanted if there was a practical approach.
Well, the very best way I can suggest is to, as I said, look at or be with the energy of what is being present when you're having this experience, and don't be with it in the context of it being depression or being anything whatsoever. Just be with it as a weird flavor of energy. And again, you're not trying to deny it or say it's not depression or anything like that. You're just letting go of all that, departing from that realm entirely, and just surfing on this weird energy of experience that is present. And in doing so, you will discover that it's not simply depression. Depression is not a simple thing. Depression is, as with any experience, is an infinite wave of complexity and subtlety and energetic presence. And if you do that effectively, you'll find yourself in a whole universe of experience that is its own entity and has nothing to do with being depression or not. But trying to deal with depression as depression just energizes the fact that you think it's depression and you're actually feeling it as a reality, as mattering. Whereas if you go to the energy of the experience You're not feeding it. You're not saying this is depression. It doesn't matter. You're not saying it matters or it doesn't matter. You're just ignoring the fact that it seems to be present as depression. You're being with it as something else entirely. And depression, we think of depression as a problem, I need to fix it. You can do this exactly the same strategy with happiness. You can do the same strategy with joy or achievement. Achievement is just as entrapping as depression is. And you can go into these things as experiential qualities, and you'll basically leave the human dimension altogether. You'll leave any realm where qualifying it as being one thing or another thing just becomes wholly irrelevant and laughable. And that's when things start to get interesting.
So really, depression is not a reason not to be awake. So
Nothing is. Yeah. And the one thing that most heavily limits us is living in a world, thinking we live in a world where there are these types of qualities. A world where there's success is just as entrapping as a world where there's failure. A world where there's pleasure is just as entrapping as a world where there's pain. And in actuality, you live wholly beyond any such world. And discovering that enables you to enjoy that fact more explicitly.
All that stuff seems to me like you get lost in reasons for things, that there are reasons for things.
Yeah, all that. You get lost in definition. Definability. This is this and that is that. Well, causality is more definition.
Yeah.
Causality is defined into existence. Any narration, any interpretation.
Yeah, sort of elaborate.
The actual world is wholly undefinable, and it's inconceivably vaster than any definable world you can cook up. So it's a lot more interesting place. Let's say.
Well, again, it all seems to me, all the kind of trouble we cook ourselves into seems so innocent. So
of course.
Basically, it seems like a good idea to try and do this. And
sure, it seems like a great idea.
Yeah, which it ain't, but somehow in that,
it's like the mouse is coming up to the rat trap with the cheese on it. Thinks it's a great idea to get that cheese. Gosh, it's just some cheese. Someone left it sitting here. Shit. What a good idea. My lucky day. Oh, look, some happiness. Some success. Wonderful. My lucky day. You think so?
In fact, Peter, it seems more and more that everything is referenceless. There just is if you take away trying to get anywhere or having been anywhere,
of course,
then it just is like this, this sort of morass of swirling matter, reality that is.
Yeah, absolutely. We spin doctor these qualities and these qualifications into existence. They're pure fantasy. They're pure spin doctoring. They have no more reality than the bullshit of a politician. It's just pure spin doctoring. And our actual world is just fascinating. It's completely undefinable. You can't say, in the actual world, there's no, are you succeeding? Are you failing? Are you happy? These questions are beyond absurd. They just don't apply. It's just like,
Yeah. Are you having a good day? Sort of completely pointless question.
Of course. Because, the actual condition is an inconceivable, infinite multidimensionality. And how can you collapse that down to good or bad, or happy or sad, or winning or losing? It's an absurdity.
Every day is a good day.
Good day to die.
Harder.
I don't know, maybe like you were saying the other day, it's just also simple. I mean, if you just sort of like, however unresolvable, etc., swirly and so forth that it is, you just relax, and that
Totally.
feels that's sweet and also I don't know, palpable in some way.
Absolutely. It's actual, it's rich, it's luscious, it's nourishing, and it sustains itself. It is actually sustaining. It's not just metaphorically sustaining, it is literally, physically, or one could say metaphysically sustaining. It is, in actuality, in the very process of sustaining itself.
Mm-hmm.
Peter, I had to go out just a minute and I came back in and I heard you saying something about the essence of noticing is very subtle or something, and I didn't connect it. I didn't hear what were you saying?
Well, earlier we had been talking about, someone asked a question, how can I tell if I'm noticing? And I said, there's a bunch of ways, but some superficial, simply obvious things is look for a wow factor,
Mm-hmm.
or for an amazing undefinability or an openness or this kind of thing. And we were developing that and talking about how noticing as one gets more skillful at it is not necessarily, you wouldn't necessarily characterize it most obviously as a wow factor. And I said, at that point when you're better at it, when it's less a question of being a neophyte and how do I know if it's happening or not, but how to develop it, how to be with it refinedly. And I said, noticing is all about subtlety, it's all about nuance. It's discovering that there is endless subtlety and unresolvability, and yet actuality, and just this this amazing ultra refined actuality that by its very nature is unresolved, paradoxical, but infinitely nuanced, infinitely subtle. The path of noticing goes to fineness. Noticing is not about backing up and going and painting things in big strokes. Noticing is about being very precisely, very very delicately with exactly what is present. In all of its inconceivable nuance and subtlety.
You have high standards. Your practice looks deceivingly simple, but it's about as high as I can imagine. It's being sort of noticing is I don't know what to say. I'm lost in words. It's so much easier to you have the following 12 steps. Take these 12 steps, and then do X, and then do Y. It's so much simpler.
Yeah.
Noticing is.
Well, noticing is reality itself,
Yeah.
and is the mode of reality itself, and reality itself cannot be encapsulated in anything other than itself. You can't encapsulate reality in a formula, or in a process, or in an assembly line. The reality can only be encapsulated in itself. So reality is noticing is reality. So the way to notice is be with reality. And it will show you what it is, and it will progressively show you how to notice. And it's at that point you're on a never-ending, bottomless process of unfolding to subtlety, to actuality, to profundity. And that's reality. That's the nature of reality. So you're letting reality be the path to reality. In Dzogchen, you say you use the goal as the path. So, and the goal is reality. So use reality as the path to reality. Very simple, very very economical, efficient. Nothing added to the mix. But it demands actuality. It demands sincerity. Because you can't. It's not about faking it with procedures or philosophy or something. It's naked. So if it's not it, it's nothing. which is not very satisfying.
It seems to me there's a euphemism there with vibratory, that there's a vibration that's going on, and the vibration is so rapid, but it's the space between the vibrations that noticing happens.
Yeah, sure. Which is just a higher frequency of vibration, and then there's the spaces between that which reveal the finer frequencies and so on.
But even to approach that takes subtlety.
It does. To notice that this is vibration demands subtlety right off the bat. And once you're with that, then the cats are loose. Then you can you know where to look. This is an inconceivably high frequency buzzing or sparkling, and that's the open gate. Let's go there and see what you find.
For me, I've gotten bad metaphor, but I've gotten a lot of mileage out of sort of letting just reality sort of grab me, and I just find myself being pulled through it.
Yeah, sure.
And it's like I said a few weeks ago, so like being in a movie and knowing that you're in the movie. It's but I lament a little bit that it doesn't happen as often as I would sort of like.
But this is part of the subtlety of it. It's always happening, but it's not always explicit. 3/4 of much more than that, if I was going to assign proportions, which is beyond absurd. But the vast majority of actual spiritual work is under the table. It's not explicit. You don't even know it's happening. It's not something that you even, And so, if you're having explicit noticing type experiences, 5% of the time, that's great, because there's a lot of stuff happening that you're not even going to be. It's not even going to be explicit.
I think even 0.000.
Again, but again, trying to quantify that is beyond absurd. But I think it's very true to say that it's not. The noticing that you noticing is not anywhere near the totality of noticing. I mean, the fact that noticing is even a reality in your life means that you're being carried away on the tidal wave of noticing, whether or not it looks like that from moment to moment. But this whole, to call it a process is absurd too, but this whole process is inconceivably subtle and inconceivably, ungraspable. It makes absolutely no sense. It has no rationale. It is actual. Go figure.
It's also Pandora's box.
It's totally Pandora's box. That's its mode. Once you start, you're screwed.
You can't go back.
That's right. Can't put the genie back in the bottle. But only a wimp would want to, so.
I was going to say, who would want to? But that genie can go any old way. I mean,
Oh yeah, all bets are off. All bets are off.
I mean, you can end up as Mother Teresa, who knows?
Oh, totally. You can have it the easy way or the hard way, and you never know which it is, even when it's happening.
Yeah.
Is this the easy way or the hard way? And it's just laughing at you.
So that brings up a question. What is discernment? Like, is that just a refinement, or how would you define discernment?
Well, I would qualify discernment as a noticing of subtlety. Even noticing that there is subtlety is discernment. And once you notice that there is subtlety, then you can notice that there's subtlety in the subtlety, and so on and so forth, and then you're off and running. And just noticing that there's more than you're used to thinking of there as being is the start of it all. You know, the only spiritual limitation is the idea that things are limited. And when you notice that that's, to any degree whatsoever, that you notice that, wait a minute, that's not really true, that's when noticing kicks in. And that's discernment, is discerning the open-endedness of actuality, or the subtlety of actuality, from the sort of dullness and staticness of our imagined, what we think is real or true, or the way we think things are, which is always a pathetic stick figure compared to the lusciousness of the actuality, right?
So the subtlety becomes the answer to the question in what to do in an infinite field of wonder, of curiosity and question about what's going on, and then say from a practical point of view, thinking of there's any number of engagements or ventures, even from practical day-to-day stuff to engage with.
Mm-hmm.
There's maybe a handful of tricks, but maybe the thing is just noticing the subtlety and see what beckons out of
Yes, absolutely. It doesn't matter where you go. I mean, you can be in anything, any portion of your experience, and just find the subtlety there. So it's not like there's one mode of being with your experience that's better than another mode. Wherever you find yourself, check out the subtlety, and bang, then that's when things take off. Because you find it anywhere, because there's nothing but. There's no such thing as an area of your experience that is not subtle. It doesn't exist. Your experience is intrinsically infinitely subtle. And noticing that is what liberates. Noticing that is what transforms our stuckness and our smallness and our separateness into what we actually are, which is this vastness, this inconceivability that this actually is. And you can find it anywhere you look, so it doesn't matter what your starting point is. So in your daily activity, anywhere, it doesn't matter where you are, in your experience, anywhere in your field of experience, just take a moment and check out the subtlety and just be with it, feel it, just trip on it, and that's all.
And the definitions and their limitations and everything, it just kind of fall off naturally.
Yeah, it just becomes irrelevant. It's not. You don't even need to stop doing that. You just all of a sudden you're beyond that.
So this is probably wrong, but when you've done that, then that seems like similar to what Longchenpa Ravchan refers to as phenomena resolving. When phenomena resolve itself.
Yeah.
And that's when all
exactly.
It's when all the labels and the categorizations fall away.
Yeah. Well, it's like peeling infinite layers of an onion. On one layer of things seeming to be a certain way, it gets disproved by its very own intrinsic subtlety. And all of a sudden that layer is just gone forever as being true. It may be there, you can go back to it and revisit it, but you know at that point it's just a sketch. It's not what it is, because you've already transcended that. Exactly, it's that. And there's no finality of that in terms of getting to a final layer, but that is the case, unstoppably is the final layer. In other words, that whatever it seems to be, it is more than that, is the finality. Not to get to some ultimate moreness. Because then you discover the open-endedness. I mean, in Dzogchen, this is the principle which is the root principle of the practice of Dzogchen, they call self-liberation, which means that any appearance whatsoever, by its very nature, liberates from what it seems to be, because it is intrinsically more than that. Or let's say more and other than that. And since it is that, that is apparent, and in that apparentness, what it seemed to be is liberated, i.e. is rendered null and void, rendered irrelevant. Which is exactly the mechanism of noticing, what I call noticing. Letting yourself be with experience in a way that is beyond what it has seemed to you to be in any particular instance.
It's funny, the Buddhists make, or at least the Gelupas make, sort of a common reference to a child looking at a fresco and just seeing, but not seeing things. And I get the sense that that's also similar to what you're talking about. I mean, if I look out,
it may be.
Then everything is. It's almost like a painting.
But maybe, but there's more than that. It's not just a matter of not qualifying it. It's also being with it with incredible intelligence and engagement. So it's not a dull. It's not just a dullness of, of not qualifying. It's like you don't have the qualifications not there because you're just dull. You have the qualifications not there because you go beyond them into the detail, into a level of detail where the qualifications are just not relevant.
Do you think children can do that or not?
Yeah, individually, it's any of these. This is not a generic mode, I think, and by and large, so much as it is an individual mode. It demands rising to a giftedness, rising to an engagement with your own deep intelligence, being able to be with your experience very intelligently. Obviously, I'm not referring to an analytical intelligence. I mean an intelligence of sensitive engagement.
This is no intellectual understanding. Anybody can get there. You don't need to be
Oh yeah, totally.
mature in any way.
Oh yeah.
Peter?
Yeah.
There's a question from you here.
Mm-hmm.
The Sarvadata distinguished consciousness and the Absolute, saying that consciousness was dependent on the body, and when the body dies, the Absolute won't know it is.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? It seems to hint to this person that this means that death is actually oblivion, at least for a while.
Well, whether it is oblivion is beside the point. The fact is that the Absolute and consciousness are one and the same thing, because consciousness arises out of the Absolute, is done by the Absolute, is made of the Absolute, so consciousness is just a mode of the Absolute. So whether consciousness is being consciousness or not being consciousness, it is the same thing, i.e. is the Absolute. So in other words, the Absolute can be conscious in a conscious modes, the Absolute can be in modes of relative oblivion. And we all know this kind of thing, at least generically, because we experience the waking state and deep sleep and dreams and so on, all these different conditions, or we can experience the relative oblivion of deep anesthesia and so on. And all of these modes are apparent modes of your experience, and yet they present with drastically different degrees of definition and so on and so forth. So there's no limit, there's no reason to suppose there's a limit to what this can be like. But to the extent there's any positivity at all, to the extent there's any intelligence at all, to the extent there's any engagement at all, these qualities are inherent in the Absolute because the Absolute's where they come from and what they're made of. The Absolute doesn't make something that's more than itself. So the Absolute is not going to be a simple oblivion, it's going to be a hyper-intelligent, hyper-engaged, hypersensitive oblivion.
I'm going there.
You're there, you are there. And I think Nisargada's differentiation between consciousness and the Absolute is more strategic than actual. He was trying to indicate, in a experiential sense, how completely transcendental reality is from the individual self, which it is. But it's a continuum. The individual self is an expression of that absolute impersonal transcendence, and that absolute impersonal transcendence is right here, right now, in the so-called personal. So they aren't actually two things, and they aren't actually separate from each other. They're just two drastically, or let's say radically different modes, apparent different modes of one thing. So Nisargadatta and I can duke it out next life.
Next lifetime.
That'll be fun.
Yeah, I want to be there.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to duke out anything with Nisargadatta.
Well, okay, good point. Maybe he'll be more of a wimp in his next life. Huh?
We would.
Maybe he'll be born as a woman or something.
Back row.
We'll take them on.
All right.
Girls are on fire.
Very excited, every one of them. Like, whoa. Probably smoking missing.
You know, the identity of the Absolute and any explicit mode is the very secret of practical spirituality, the very secret of yoga. The reason why you can find transcendence in your experience is because it is actually here. You know, the Absolute is. This is a mode of the Absolute. So as such, you can be with this, whatever it seems to be explicitly, and find the Absolute. You know, if you have the wit to know where to look. And of course, the best way to find that is the Absolute's mode, which is hyper-intelligent self-engagement.
Santa Cruz, you said something that was completely mysterious to me, but totally captured me. You said that when people were talking with one another, that what was really going on was completely inconceivable, and was sort of impossible to talk about. And I just love that idea somehow.
Well, I think it's really self-evident. I mean, even someone in a shop arguing with someone that works there, a clerk or something. I mean, right away there's so much going on in the exchange that so much more than just the words, and they can be summed up very, very arbitrarily and partially as all this body language, and there's emotionality, and there's inflection, and there's this and there's that, and there's but I would say there's also all sorts of psychic resonances and personality sympathies and antipathies and all sorts of things that are just an incredibly complex and subtle multidimensional stew of interaction on many, many levels. And most of them are not explicit, at least in terms of sort of the human acknowledgement of what happens in an engagement. And this is always the case, and I think it's to me it's very obviously always the case, and I think it is to most people. Even you meet someone you've never seen before, and you immediately have a take on them. You kind of like them or you don't like them or whatever, right? Where does that come from? I mean, it's not. You can't. It's something. There's something there. There's some kind of exchange, interaction that is meaningful, that is not explicit. It's not. In human terms, you can't say something they said or something, the way they moved their hand or something. It's not like that. It's something, or it's not one thing. It's just a whole gestalt of subtle, complex interaction. And of course, not just with so-called sentient beings, but with everything. You interact with, physical things and so on and so forth in the same way. It's just that our engagement with the environment is like a full frontal, full body contact kind of thing, metaphorically speaking, right? I mean, this is a large part of what noticing is. It's just noticing how engaged we already are with our experience. It's not rising to a new level of engagement or learning how to be engaged in a way that we have never been, so much as just noticing the ways in which we already are. I mean, noticing is all about noticing what is already the case. It's not about the creation of some new modes of functioning or something. Because we already are doing all of this with incredible, inconceivable subtlety. And typically it's just not acknowledged because the human, sort of conceptual modes of what's going on just don't have language for that. We had a bit of a train of discussion loosely ongoing in several recent meetings about the so-called conscious mind versus unconscious mind, and this is all related to that kind of thing. We acknowledge, we acknowledge and interpret what's going on according to what the conscious mind can grasp, but the unconscious mind is also simultaneously engaged in experience in its own way, in real time, but it's not generally, but the conscious mind doesn't acknowledge it, the conscious mind doesn't notice it, doesn't even think of it as existing. And again, this is just simply that we are cut off from recognizing or acknowledging a large, vast areas of our own engagement with our being, with our experience, because they're too strangely nonlinear and irrational and so on and so forth. And noticing is really about bridging that barrier. Noticing is about noticing the unconscious, so-called unconscious modes of experience. So the conscious mind and the unconscious mind are discovered to be one continuum, which of course they are. using conscious and unconscious in terms of sort of pop psychology. I mean, I'm not educated in psychological theory or anything.
there's this assumption of lives and past lives and reincarnation. Reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it seems to me that what they're describing is in the second part of it, you're actually in a state of pure awareness.
Mm-hmm.
It is not any time, including when you're not alive, a time to become aware.
Of course.
So, what is it that happens between the second bardo and the rebirth that takes that away?
Misinterpretation. Same thing that always takes it away. The same thing that if you think you're if one thinks one's incarnated right now, one thinks that based on conclusions drawn erroneously from misinterpretation.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, the instructions for the bardo are the same as the instructions for Dzogchen, which of course it can apply any time, including a waking life,
yes.
and, so-called incarnate life, which is to recognize what this actually is, to recognize the radiance, to recognize that absolute transcendence, by its very nature, appears to itself as all sorts of apparent energy patterns, without anything being actually there other than the absolute. That's the case right now, that's the case after death. And it's the misinterpretation that causes falling into an apparent incarnation, into apparent circumstances, into an apparent birth, into apparent life, and so on.
It was my understanding from my reading that you didn't go from the first to the second, or from the second to the third, without already realizing that.
Without realizing it in what sense?
Awareness, realizing this.
No, what causes the transition is not realizing it. If you realize, according to the Tibetan schema of the after-death bardos, the first is naked reality.
Right.
Qualityless, absolute naked reality. And according to them, if you can recognize that, great, and then you stay there. Nothing leaves that. And then the second bardo will light, what they call light, sounds, and rays will start to arise, which basically just means the apparition of energies, which are nothing but the absolute itself. Just like in a dream, when a dream starts when you're sleeping, sort of apparitions of light and sound and so on start to appear.
Or like Togal.
Yeah, exactly so. Which is why Togal is considered the powerful practice for liberation in the bardo, because you're trained. You train yourself. Basically through familiarity to recognize the transcendent apparition of lights as not being objectively true. It's falling into the interpretation of these things as being objective and outside yourself that causes the interpretation of, there's a world here, there's a world, there's a me, there's entities, and all of a sudden there's an environment and there's circumstances, and bang, all of a sudden you're incarnated. But the incarnation is interpretation. There's no actual incarnation. And coming to see that can happen at any time. It can happen right now, which is Dzogchen's about coming to see that in any bardo, including the bardo of waking life. But the Tibetans hold that it's easiest to do after death because things are so nakedly clear. Things are very deconstructed and very nakedly obvious in terms of what they are, whereas in the waking condition is considered to be arguably the worst, most challenging, because everything's jumbled together. But they recommend. That's why they recommend the Dzogchen practice as a So if you can use Dzogchen and get liberation in the waking life, more power to you. But basically, you're training yourself most powerfully for recognition in the afterlife, and any habitual noticing you build up in the waking life will be very much more easy to exercise in the after-death bardos, so, according to their theory. But the basic formula applies in all the conditions, which is that this is what it is absolute transcendence, and is not and there's nothing but. And anything that seems to be other than that is an erroneous interpretation. So being incarnated, having a life, being an entity, having a history, all these things are just interpreted into existence erroneously, through oversimplified interpretation. And at any time it's possible to see the actual condition, which is that this is inconceivable transcendence, essentially appearing to itself while not departing from itself. And there's nothing here but it. And seeing that constitutes liberation from incarnation, from life, from death, from everything. Not necessarily a cessation of those things, because they aren't actually in existence as things. They are this absolute transcendent condition, which inconceivably and by its own inherent nature seems to appear as all this.
Well, this would never be less than its own.
Right.
So there's no lesser version.
No, there's no lesser. Well, lesser can only exist in imagination. Limitation can only exist in imagination. Separation can only exist in imagination. Because what this is intrinsically is absolute, inconceivable, infinite transcendence, you might say. And it can't be less than that, and it never departs from that. It is always in a continual, ongoing condition of that condition. And that's the only thing that there is. That is the solar condition, that is reality. And so seeing that constitutes liberation, constitutes realization. Not seeing that constitutes delusion. With the implied incarnation, basically incarnation into imagined circumstances and imagined, in other words, whatever you free associate on this transcendental Rorschach blot of wow is your prison.
Well, but you also, it's also with knowing there's no lesser, you can see the inherent and utter playfulness of
Oh yeah.
I mean,
sure.
it's for fun.
Sure. Yeah, it is for fun.
Let's reincarnate for fun.
Sure. Yeah, that's the other side of the coin. Is who gives a shit about liberation?
Yeah, liberation is
Yeah.
all of it.
Yeah, because it never loses anything. It has nothing to fear. It doesn't give a shit. It can go through, a billion, 100,000 lifetimes of pain and suffering, and what a hoot! What a good ride. God, that was fun. What are we going to do next?
What's the second?
No, absolutely. There's a lot of ways to spin it, but seeing it is the beginning. Seeing it is the seeing that is the case is the revelation of what's going on here.
Feels more like becoming it.
But you already are it, so it's becoming. It is a becoming. So seeing it is to see becoming. Because its very nature is to be becoming. But it's just becoming itself. It's not becoming something else.
Yeah,
right. Yeah, I mean, that's the real high water mark of spirituality. This is the absolute. This is, in actual fact, the absolute. The absolute that everyone's been touting about. This is it. And that being the case, it's discoverable. And even if it's not discovered, it's the case. So that's good news. So, I mean, that's the power, that's the real, what's the word? What's the word? There's a really good word, which is the authority of spirituality.
Authority.
Yeah, the authority of spirituality. Spirituality isn't just some bullshit that someone cranked out of like, oh, well, this is a cute idea. There's some authority behind it, and the authority is that this is reality. And so this has the authority of reality itself. And since the practice of this exploration is reality and is done by reality, it has authority. So the whole thing is connected to, it's hardwired to 220. It's not just hot air.
Did you say something? Somebody here is asking, what does hardwired to 220 mean?
It's a very, very loose allegory.
Well, he's not American, so he's not sure what you're talking.
It means it's plugged into high power.
Oh, okay. Instead of usual, what is it, 120?
Around here, yeah.
I don't know.
Well, the point is it's
higher voltage.
It's being powered.
Yeah.
It's not just spin doctoring.
Freewheeling.
Yeah.
Going over time now, Peter.
Oh yeah, that's true.
That's
Well, not quite. According to the out now internet time, it's quitting time. Good night, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Oh,